The Great Hall of Station Meridian was the largest structure ever built by any species in the known galaxy, and it floated in the empty space between three star systems, like a monument to cooperation and peace and the promise that different beings could live together without war. 850 delegates had gathered there from every corner of civilized space, and they sat in their assigned seats, arranged in a massive circle that rose up toward a domed ceiling made of transparent crystal, and beyond that ceiling, the stars burned cold, and Eternal High Chancellor Veltris stood at the center of the chamber on a platform that hovered above the floor, and his forearms were spread wide as he addressed the assembly in his deep, rumbling voice that echoed off the walls and filled every corner of the vast space. He was old even by the standards of his long-lived species, and his blue-scaled skin had faded to a pale gray, and his eyes, which had once been sharp and golden, were now clouded with age, but his voice remained strong, and his words carried the weight of absolute authority. Today, we gather to address a threat that has grown too large to ignore, he said, and the delegates leaned forward in their seats because they knew what was coming, and many of them had been waiting for this moment for years. The species known as humanity has been part of our galactic community for only 300 years, he continued, and in that short time they have spread to 47 worlds, and they have built fleets that rival our own, and they have developed technologies that we do not fully understand. Paused and let his words sink in, and the silence in the chamber was heavy and thick. They are unstable, he said, and they are unpredictable, and they are dangerous, and we cannot allow them to continue on their current path. A murmur ran through the assembly, and delegates turned to look at each other, and some nodded in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The motion before us today is simple, Veltris said, and his voice grew harder and colder, and it is necessary, and we must pass it for the good of all civilized peoples. The motion is this, he said, and he raised one of his four arms and pointed toward the great display screen that hung above the chamber, and words appeared on that screen in every language known to the galaxy. Humanity is hereby banned from all galactic territories, and all human colonies must be evacuated within 30 standard days, and all trade with human worlds is forbidden, and any species that violates this ban will face severe consequences. Chamber erupted in noise as delegates shouted their approval or their objections, and the sound was like a storm breaking over the ocean, and it went on until Veltris raised all four of his arms and demanded silence. We will vote now, he said, and the voting machines activated, and each delegate pressed their button, and the results appeared on the screen. Almost instantly, 847 in favor and 3 opposed. The ban was passed. Veltris allowed himself a small smile, and he stepped down from his platform, and his advisors gathered around him to offer their congratulations, and delegates began to file out of the chamber, talking excitedly among themselves. None of them noticed the woman standing on the observation deck above the chamber, and none of them saw her watching the vote with calm, steady eyes. Her name was Emily Park, and she wore the plain gray uniform of a cargo handler, and her credentials identified her as a low-level freight worker assigned to Station Meridian, and there was nothing remarkable about her appearance, and nothing that would make anyone look twice. She was 34 years old, with black hair cut short and practical, and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything, and a face that was neither beautiful nor ugly, but simply ordinary in a way that made it easy to forget she had been on Station Meridian for 6 years. And in that time, she had moved cargo containers and cleaned storage bays and done all the small, thankless jobs that kept the station running, and no one had ever questioned her presence because she was exactly what she appeared to be. Nobody a background character in the great drama of galactic civilization. She watched the delegates celebrate their victory, and she watched the display screens replay the vote count over and over, and she listened to the commentary from the news feeds that were already declaring this a historic moment. The Human threat has been neutralized, one commentator said, and his voice was smug and satisfied, and the galaxy can finally rest easy. Emily finished her drink and she set down the glass, and she stood up from her seat, and she walked toward the exit with slow, deliberate steps. She did not look angry, and she did not look scared, and she did not look defeated. She looked like someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The corridors of Station Meridian were crowded with beings of every shape and size, and they pushed past Emily without seeing her, and they talked about the vote and what it would mean and how quickly the humans would be forced to leave. Emily walked through them like a ghost, and she made her way toward the central chamber where the delegates were still gathered and where High Chancellor Veltris was accepting congratulations from his allies. She reached the great doors that led into the chamber, and two security guards stepped in front of her, and they were tall and muscular, and their weapons were already drawn. No entry, one of them said, and his voice was bored because he had said these words 1,000 times before, and he expected the cargo handler to simply turn around and walk away. Emily reached into her pocket, and she pulled out a small metal disc, no larger than a coin, and she held it up so the guards could see it. "What is that?" the second guard asked. And there was a hint of unease in his voice because something about the disc made his scales itch. The lights in the corridor flickered and then went dark, and the guards' weapons made a soft whining sound and then fell silent, and every scanner and sensor within 100 meters simply stopped working. Emily stepped past the frozen guards, and she pushed open the great doors, and she walked into the assembly chamber. 850 delegates turned to look at her, and High Chancellor Veltris stopped speaking in mid-sentence, and the silence that fell over the chamber was absolute. Emily walked to the center of the room, and she stepped onto the hovering platform where Veltris had stood, and she looked out at the gathered representatives of galactic civilization. "Remove this intruder," Veltris commanded, and his voice cracked with anger and confusion, because no one had ever dared to interrupt an assembly session, and certainly not a lowly cargo handler. But the guards did not move, and the security systems did not respond, and the chamber remained locked in that strange frozen silence. Emily waited until she was sure she had everyone's attention, and then she spoke, and her voice was calm and clear, and it carried to every corner of the vast home. "My name is Emily Park," she said, "and I am Earthborn, and I am a citizen of the human race, and I believe there has been a misunderstanding." She paused, and she looked at Veltris, and she smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. "You have just voted to ban my people from the galaxy," she said, "and you have done this because you fear us, and you do not understand us, and you think we are a threat." She reached up, and she removed the cargo handler badge from her uniform, and she dropped it on the floor. "But I am here to tell you that you have made a terrible mistake," she said, "and before this day is over, you will understand exactly how terrible." The delegates stared at her in shock, and Veltris opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, and Emily Park began to tell them the truth. The silence in the assembly chamber stretched on, and every delegate sat frozen in their seat, staring at the small human woman who stood on the central platform as if she belonged there. High Chancellor Veltris was the first to recover, and he stepped forward with his forearms raised in a gesture of command, and his old eyes burned with fury. "You dare," he said, and his voice was a low, dangerous growl that made the nearest delegates shrink back in their seats, "and you dare to interrupt the sacred proceedings of the Galactic Concord, and you dare to stand where only the High Chancellor may stand." Emily Park did not move, and she did not look afraid, and she simply watched him with those calm brown eyes that seemed to see right through him. "I dare," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried through the chamber like a whisper that somehow everyone could hear. "And I dare because someone had to." Veltris turned to his guards, and he pointed at Emily with one trembling arm, and his voice rose to a shout. "Seize her," he commanded, "and remove her from this chamber, and throw her in the detention cells, where she will await trial for her crimes against the Concord." The guards tried to move, and Emily could see them straining against invisible bonds, and their muscles bulged, and their faces twisted with effort. But they could not take a single step. The doors would not open, and the weapons would not fire, and every system in the chamber remained locked and silent. "What have you?" Dunvelters demanded, and there was a new note in his voice now, and it was the sound of fear creeping in around the edges of his anger. Emily reached into her pocket, and she pulled out the small metal disc, and she held it up so everyone could see. "This is a neural lock," she said, "and it is technology that your scientists have never seen because we never showed it to you, and it does not harm anyone, and it does not kill anyone, and it simply makes your systems do what I tell them to do." She turned slowly on the platform, and she looked at each section of the chamber, and she met the eyes of delegates from 100 different species. "I could have used this to destroy your station," she said, "and I could have used this to cripple your fleets, and I could have used this to throw your entire civilization into chaos, but I did not," she said. "And do you want to know why?" No one answered, and no one moved, and the fear in the chamber was thick enough to taste. "Because that is not who we are," Emily said. "And that is not what humans do." She lowered the disc, and she slipped it back into her pocket, and the guards suddenly stumbled forward as their bodies were released from the lock, and they raised their weapons and pointed them at her. "Wait," Veltries said, and his voice was different now, and it was the voice of someone who wanted answers more than he wanted revenge. "And let her speak, and let us hear what she has to say." Emily nodded, and she took a deep breath, and she began to tell them the truth. "You think you know what humans are," she said, "and you think we are young and reckless and dangerous, and you think we have only been part of your galaxy for 300 years. She paused, and she smiled, and it was a sad smile full of secrets. "You are wrong," she said, "and we have been here for much longer than that, and we have been watching you and learning from you and helping you in ways you never knew." A murmur ran through the chamber, and delegates turned to look at each other with confusion and disbelief. 200 years ago," Emily said, "and long before we officially made contact with the Galactic Concord, and we sent out our first explorers, and they came to your worlds, and they learned your languages, and they studied your cultures, and they blended in. We call ourselves the Quiet Ones," she said, "and there are thousands of us, and we are everywhere." She gestured toward the delegates, and her arm swept across the entire chamber. "We are engineers on your starship," she said, "and we are doctors in your hospitals, and we are teachers in your schools, and we are workers in your factories, and we are clerks in your offices. We have lived among you for 2 centuries, she said, "and we have raised families among you, and we have grown old among you. And many of us have died among you, and you never knew we were there." "That is impossible," someone shouted from the upper rows of the chamber, and it was a delegate from the Karathi collective, and his face was pale with shock, "and we would have detected you, and our scanners would have found you." Emily shook her head, and she reached up, and she touched the skin behind her ear, and there was a small scar there that was barely visible. "We adapted," she said, "and we changed ourselves so that your scanners would not see us, and we learned to mimic your biology and your brain patterns and your life signs, and we became invisible." "But why?" another delegate demanded, and this one was from the lesser homeworld, and her voice was high and thin with confusion. "And why would you do this, and what did you want from us?" Emily turned to face the lesser delegate, and her eyes were soft with something that looked almost like love. "We wanted to help you," she said, "and we wanted to understand you, and we wanted to be part of something greater than ourselves." She walked to the edge of the platform, and she looked down at the delegates below her. "When we first discovered that we were not alone in the universe," she said, "and when we first learned that there were other intelligent species out there among the stars, and we were afraid." She paused, and she let the word hang in the air. "We were afraid that you would destroy us," she said, "and we were afraid that you would reject us, and we were afraid that we were not good enough to join your civilization. So we sent the Quiet Ones," she said, "and we sent them to learn and to watch and to wait and to prove that humans could be trusted. And do you know what they found? Emily asked, and her voice grew stronger and filled with pride. They found that your civilization was not as perfect as it seemed, she said. And they found that you had problems that you could not solve. And they found that you needed help, and so they helped, she said, and they helped in secret. And they helped without asking for anything in return, and they helped because that is what humans do. The chamber was silent now, and the fear had faded, and in its place was something else. And it was the beginning of understanding. You voted to ban use today, Emily said, and you voted to cast us out of the galaxy because you feared us, but we have been here all along, she said, and we have been holding your civilization together in ways you never noticed, and we have been saving your lives and solving your problems and making your worlds better. She turned to face High Chancellor Veltris, and she looked directly into his clouded old eyes. And now she said, and now I'm going to show you exactly what we have done. She raised her hand and she pressed a button on her wrist, and the great display screen above the chamber flickered to life, and the truth began to unfold. The display screen above the assembly chamber was enormous, and it stretched from one side of the dome ceiling to the other. And when it flickered to life, every delegate in the room turned to look at it. Emily Park stood on the central platform, with her hand raised, and the light from the screen cast strange shadows across her face, and she looked like something more than human in that moment, and something ancient and powerful and wise. Let me tell you a story, she said, and it is a story about a plague. The screen showed images of a world, and it was a beautiful world with purple oceans and silver forests and cities that gleamed like jewels under a pale blue sun. This is Veltris Prime, Emily said, and it is the homeworld of the High Chancellor, and it is the heart of the Galactic conquered. Veltris stiffened in his seat, and his four hands clenched into fists, and his old eyes narrowed with suspicion. 43 years ago, Emily continued, and a plague swept across this world, and it was called the Thesser Plague because it was carried by traders from the Thesser system, and it spread faster than anyone could have imagined. The screen showed images of the sick and the dying, and bodies piled in the streets, and hospitals overflowing, with patients and doctors working around the clock with desperation in their eyes. Your scientists worked day and night to find a cure, Emily said, and they tried everything they knew, and nothing worked, and the death toll climbed higher and higher. She paused, and she let the images speak for themselves. In 6 months, Emily said, and 12 million people died, and the plague showed no signs of stopping, and your government began to prepare for the worst. The screen changed, and it showed a laboratory. And inside that laboratory was a figure in a protective suit, working at a console and running tests and analyzing data. This is David Kim, Emily said, and he was a human, and he was one of the quiet ones, and he had been working in a Veltrian research facility for 15 years. No one knew he was human, she said, and his co-workers thought he was a member of a minor species from the Outer Rim, and they never questioned his presence because he was quiet and hardworking and brilliant. The delegates leaned forward in their seats, and their eyes were fixed on the screen. David Kim worked on the plague for 3 months, Emily said, and he worked alone, and he worked in secret, and he used techniques that your scientists had never seen because they were human techniques developed on Earth. She smiled, and it was a proud smile, and he found the cure, she said. Screens showed documents and research papers and medical records, and all of them bore the stamp of the Veltrian Health Ministry, and all of them credited the cure to an anonymous researcher. He never asked for credit, Emily said, and he never revealed himself, and he simply gave you the cure and walked away and went back to his regular job as if nothing had happened. She turned to face High Chancellor Veltris, and her eyes were steady and calm. That cure saved your world, she said, and it saved your people, and it saved you because you were infected too, and you were dying, and David Kim saved your life. Veltris opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, and his face was pale, and his hands were shaking. Emily turned back to the screen, and she pressed another button on her Rest, let me tell you another story, she said, and this one is about your quantum relay network. The screen showed a vast web of stations and satellites and transmission nodes that stretched across the entire galaxy. And it was the network that allowed instant communication between worlds, and it was the backbone of galactic civilization. 15 years ago, Emily said, and this network began to fail, and the relay stations started to malfunction, and communication became unreliable, and your engineers could not figure out why. She showed images of technicians working on massive machines and running diagnostics and shaking their heads in frustration. The problem was in the core architecture, Emily said, and it was a flaw that had been there from the beginning, and it had finally reached a breaking point. Your engineers estimated that the network would collapse completely within 2 years, she said, and when that happened, your civilization would collapse with it, because you cannot run a galactic government without instant communication. The screen changed again, and it showed a woman, and she was sitting at a console, and her fingers were moving across the keyboard with incredible speed. This is Grace Lee, Emily said, and she was a human, and she was one of the quiet ones, and she had been working as a systems engineer for the Galactic Communication Authority for 20 years. Grace Lee redesigned the entire core architecture, Emily said, and she worked for 18 months, and she fixed every flaw, and she made the network stronger and faster and more reliable than it had ever been. She is listed in your official records as a consulting specialist, Emily said, and her species is not identified, and no one ever thought to ask, because she did her job, and she did it well, and she never caused any problems. The delegates were murmuring now, and some of them were pulling up records on their personal devices and checking the information, and their faces showed shock and disbelief as they confirmed what Emily was telling them. Emily pressed her wrist again, and the screen changed once more. Let me tell you one more story, she said, and this one is about war. Screen showed 2 fleets of warships, and they were facing each other across a field of asteroids, and their weapons were charged, and their shields were up, and they were moments away from battle. This is the Kreth Civil War, Emily said, and it happened 20 years ago, and it nearly destroyed the Kreth Empire, and it nearly destabilized the entire eastern quadrant of the galaxy. The 2 factions had been fighting for 3 years, she said, and millions had died, and neither side was willing to surrender, and it looked like the war would continue until one side or the other was completely destroyed. She showed images of burned cities and refugee camps and children crying in the ruins of their homes, and then Emily said, and a mediator appeared, and no one knew where he came from, and no one knew his name, and he simply walked into the peace conference and began to talk. The screen showed a man, and he was sitting at a table with representatives from both factions, and his face was calm and patient, and he listened more than he spoke. This is Michael Cho, Emily said, and he was a human, and he was one of the quiet ones, and he spent 6 months negotiating a peace treaty that ended the war. He is credited in your records as an anonymous mediator, Emily said, and the Kreth government has never revealed his identity because they were embarrassed that an outsider had to solve their problems for them. She lowered her hand, and the screen went dark, and she turned to face the assembly. These are just 3 examples, she said, and there are hundreds more, and there are thousands of quiet ones scattered across the galaxy, and every single one of them has a story like this. We have cured your plagues, she said, and we have fixed your machines, and we have ended your wars, and we have fed your hungry, and we have taught your children, and we have done all of this without asking for anything in return. She walked to the edge of the platform, and she looked down at the delegates. You see us as a threat, she said, and you see us as dangerous and unpredictable, and you voted to ban us from the galaxy. But we have spent 200 years saving you from yourself, she said, and we did not do this because we wanted power, and we did not do this because we wanted recognition. She paused, and her voice grew soft, and there were tears in her eyes. We did this because we believe that helping others is what makes a species worthy of the stars, she said, and we did this because that is who we are. The chamber was silent, and no one moved, and no one spoke. And Emily stood alone on the platform, with the weight of her revelation hanging in the air, and then slowly one delegate began to stand. The delegate who stood was Ambassador Threll of the Karathi Collective, and he was tall and thin with pale skin that shimmered like moonlight, and his eyes were large and dark and filled with an emotion that was difficult to read. He stood in his seat in the upper rows of the chamber, and every eye in the room turned to look at him, and he did not speak for a long moment, and he simply looked at Emily Park with an expression of wonder and shame. "I have something to say," he finally spoke, and his voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent chamber, and it trembled with the weight of confession. 20 years ago, he said, and my world was dying. Paused, and he swallowed hard, and his hands gripped the railing in front of him. Our crops had failed, he said, and a blight had swept across our farmlands, and our food reserves were empty, and our people were starving by the millions. The other delegates watched him with growing unease, because they could see where this story was going, and they did not want to hear it, but they could not look away. Our scientists tried everything, he said, and they engineered new crops, and they treated the soil, and they did everything they could think of, and nothing worked. He looked directly at Emily, and his dark eyes were wet with tears that he did not try to hide. And then a woman came to us, he said, and she was an agricultural specialist, and she said she was from a minor colony world in the outer territories, and she offered to help. Her name was Jennifer Yu, he said, and she worked on our farms for 2 years, and she developed new techniques and new treatments and new ways of growing food that our scientists had never imagined. She saved us, he said, and she saved my people, and she saved my family, and I never knew she was human. He sat down heavily in his seat, and he buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook with silent sobs. The chamber was quiet for a moment, and then another delegate stood, and this one was Admiral Vex of the Stellar Navy, and he was a massive creature with armor plates covering his body and eyes that burned like red coals. He did not look like someone who would ever admit weakness, but his voice was soft when he spoke. "The tactical systems that run our entire fleet," he said, "and they were designed by a man named William Beek, and he worked for the Naval Research Division for 30 years, and everyone thought he was a genius." He paused, and he looked at Emily, and there was respect in his burning eyes. "He was human," he said, "and I am certain of it now, and he never asked for recognition, and he never asked for promotion, and he simply did his work and made our fleet the strongest in the galaxy." More delegates began to stand, and more stories began to emerge in the chamber, filled with voices confessing secrets that had been buried for years and decades. A delegate from the mining colonies spoke about an engineer named Thomas Hahn, who had developed new safety protocols that had saved thousands of lives. A delegate from the Medical Research Council spoke about a researcher named Susan Kwan, who had made breakthroughs in genetic therapy that had cured diseases thought to be incurable. A delegate from the Educational Board spoke about a teacher named Robert Shin, who had developed new learning methods that had transformed schools across a dozen worlds. One by one, the stories poured out, and each one was the same, and each one was about a human who had helped and healed and saved without ever revealing themselves and without ever asking for anything in return. High Chancellor Veltris listened to all of this with a face like stone, and his 4 arms were crossed over his chest, and his clouded eyes gave nothing away. When the last story had been told and the last delegate had sat down, he rose from his seat, and he walked to the edge of his platform, and he looked at Emily Park. "These revelations change nothing," he said, and his voice was cold and hard, and it cut through the emotional atmosphere of the chamber like a blade. "If anything," he said, "and they prove that humans are exactly what we feared, and they are manipulative and secretive, and they have infiltrated our civilization without our knowledge or consent, he turned to address the other delegates, and his voice grew louder and more forceful. "Do you not see what they have done?" he demanded. "And they have made themselves indispensable, and they have wormed their way into every part of our society, and they have been watching us and studying us and waiting for the right moment." Emily did not react to his words, and she simply stood on her platform and watched him with those calm, steady eyes. "The ban must stand," Veltri said, "and we must protect ourselves from this threat. And we must remove these infiltrators from our worlds before it is too late." He pointed at Emily with one trembling arm. "She admits that there are thousands of them," he said, "and thousands of humans hiding among us and pretending to be our friends, while they spy on us and manipulate us." Some of the delegates nodded in agreement, and the fear that Emily had dispelled began to creep back into the chamber, and the atmosphere shifted and became hostile once more. Emily waited until Veltris had finished speaking, and then she stepped forward on her platform, and she raised her voice so that everyone could hear you. "All right," she said, "and there are thousands of us, and we have been among you for 200 years. She paused, and she looked around the chamber at all the frightened faces, and in all that time she said, "And in 200 years of living among you and working among you and raising families among you, and not once have we ever betrayed you." She let that sink in, and she watched as some of the delegates began to think about what she had said. "We could have stolen your secrets," she said, "and we could have sabotaged your systems, and we could have started wars, and we could have done 1,000 terrible things. But we did not," she said. "And because that is not who we are," she walked to the very edge of her platform, and she looked directly at High Chancellor Velchisiu. "Call us manipulative," she said, but we have never manipulated you, and we have only helped you. You call us secretive," she said, but we kept our secret because we knew you were not ready to accept us, and we knew you would react with fear instead of gratitude. "You call us a threat," she said, but we have spent 200 years proving that we are the opposite of a threat." She turned to face the entire assembly, and her voice grew soft and filled with emotion. "You can ban us," she said, "and you can force us to leave, and you can hunt down every quiet one and send them back to Earth. But ask yourselves this," she said, "and what kind of galaxy do you want to live in?" She paused, as she let the question hang in the air. "Do you want a galaxy built on fear?" she asked, "and a galaxy where different species look at each other with suspicion and hatred, or do you want a galaxy built on trust?" she asked, "and a galaxy where different species work together and help each other and lift each other up?" She turned, and she began to walk toward the edge of the platform and toward the doors that led out of the chamber. "Choice is yours," she said, "and it always has been." She stepped off the platform, and she walked past the frozen guards, and she walked past the staring delegates, and she walked through the great doors and out into the corridor beyond and behind her. The assembly chamber exploded into chaos as 850 delegates began to argue about the future of the galaxy. 3 days passed on Station Meridian, and in all that time the debates never stopped and the arguments never ended, and the delegates barely slept as they wrestled with the choice that Emily Park had placed before them. The news feeds broadcast everything, and across the galaxy billions of beings watched as their representatives fought over the fate of humanity, and opinions were divided, and tempers were high, and it seemed like the Concord itself might tear apart. High Chancellor Veltris led the faction that wanted to keep the ban in place, and he argued that humans were too dangerous and too unpredictable, and that the revelations about the Quiet Ones only proved that they could not be trusted. But Ambassador Thrall led a growing faction that wanted to overturn the ban, and he argued that humans had proven themselves through 2 centuries of selfless service, and that fear was not a good foundation for civilization. Emily Park did not participate in the debates, and she did not appear before the assembly again, and she simply waited on the observation deck, where she had first watched the ban being announced, and she looked out at the stars and she thought about her people. On the morning of the 4th day, the vote was Finally called, the delegates filed into the assembly chamber one by one, and their faces were tired and drawn, and many of them looked like they had not slept in days, and the weight of their decision pressed down on them like a physical force. Hi. Chancellor Veltris stood on his platform, and his whole body was bent with exhaustion, but his voice was still strong when he called for order. "We have debated long enough," he said, "and now it is time to decide and let the vote be cast to voting machines." Activated, and each delegate pressed their button, and the results appeared on the great display screen above the chamber. 612 in favor of overturning the ban, and 238 opposed the ban was overturned. A great cheer went up from one side of the chamber, and a groan of despair went up from the other, and High Chancellor Veltris stood frozen on his platform, as if he could not believe what had just happened. But the vote was final, and the decision was made. And humanity would not be cast out of the Galaxy Ambassador. Thrall rose from his seat, and he walked to the central platform, and he raised his arms for silence, and the chamber slowly grew quiet. "This vote is only the beginning," he said, "and we have not simply decided to tolerate humanity, and we have decided to embrace them." He turned to face the display screen, and new words appeared on it. And they were the terms of something called the Integration Accord. "From this day forward," he said, "and humanity will not be a minor species on the edges of our civilization, and they will be full partners in the Galactic Concord." He read the terms of the accord, and they were generous, and they were unprecedented, and they gave humanity a seat on the High Council, and a voice in all major decisions, and access to all the resources and opportunities of galactic civilization. "The quiet ones will be honored," he said, "and not hunted. And they will be recognized for their service and their sacrifice, and their names will be recorded in the histories of every world they helped." Paused, and he looked around the chamber at the delegates who had opposed the vote, and his voice grew softer. "I know that many of you are still afraid," he said, "and I know that many of you still do not trust humans, and I understand your fears because I shared them once, but fear is a poor guide," he said, "and it leads us to make decisions we will regret, and it blinds us to the truth that is right in front of our eyes. The truth is this," he said, "and humans are not our enemies, and they are not a threat, and they are our partners and our friends, and they have been saving us for 200 years. He stepped down from the platform, and the chamber began to empty, and the delegates filed out to send word to their governments and to begin the long process of implementing the accord on the observation deck above the chamber. Emily Park watched it all unfold, and there were tears streaming down her face, and she did not try to wipe them away. A sound made her turn, and she saw a small figure standing in the doorway, and it was a child, and the child was Desser, and her skin was pale and translucent, and her eyes were huge and curious. The child walked toward Emily with hesitant steps, and she stopped a few feet away, and she looked up at the human woman with wonder. "Are you really Earthborn?" the child asked, and her voice was high and thin and filled with innocent curiosity. Emily smiled, and she knelt down so that she was at eye level with the child. "I am," she said, "and I am Earthborn, and my name is Emily. And what is your name?" "My name is Lyra," the child said, "and my teacher told us about humans today, and she said, 'You are very strange, but also very kind.'" Emily laughed, and it was a warm sound that filled the observation deck. "Your teacher is right," she said, "and we are very strange, and we know that we are strange, and we have always known." She paused, and she thought about how to explain it in words that a child could understand. "We come from a small world," she said, "and it is blue and green, and it circles a yellow sun, and for a very long time we thought we were alone in the universe." The child nodded, and her huge eyes grew even wider when we discovered that we were not alone, Emily said, "and we were scared, and we did not know if the other species would accept us, and we did not know if we were good enough to join the great civilizations of the galaxies." "So, what did you do?" the child asked. Emily smiled, and she reached out and she gently touched the child on the shoulder. "We decided to prove ourselves," she said, And we decided to show the galaxy that humans could be trusted, and we decided to help wherever we could, even if no one ever knew we were helping the child." Thought about this for a moment, and her small face was serious and thoughtful. "That sounds very hard," she said. "And did you ever want to give up, Emily?" Nodded, and there was a faraway look in her eyes. "Many times," she said, "and there were many times when we thought it was hopeless, and there were many times when we wanted to reveal ourselves and demand recognition, but we did not," she said, "and we kept working, and we kept helping, and we kept believing that someday things would be different." She looked out at the stars, and she thought about all the quiet ones scattered across the galaxy, and all the work they had done, and all the lives they had saved. "And today," Emily said, "and today things are finally different." The child followed her gaze, and they stood together looking out at the stars and at the ships that were already departing to spread the news of the integration accord. "What is it like?" the child asked. "And what is it like being human?" Emily considered the question, and she thought about all the things she could say and all the ways she could explain what it meant to be Earthborn. It means believing that tomorrow can be better than today, she finally said, "and it means being willing to work for it, even when no one is watching." Child nodded slowly, and she did not fully understand, but something in Emily's words stayed with her, and it was like a seed planted in fertile soil, and it would grow in ways that neither of them could imagine. Emily stood up, and she took one last look at the stars, and then she turned and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" the child called after her. Emily paused, and she looked back over her shoulder, and she smiled. "Back to work," she said, "and there is still so much to do." She walked out of the observation deck and into the corridors of Station Meridian, and she disappeared into the crowds of beings who were celebrating and arguing and trying to make sense of everything that had happened, and across the galaxy, and labs and hospitals and ships and schools, the quiet ones continued their work, and they heard the news of the integration accord, and many of them wept with joy and relief. But they did not stop working, and they did not reveal themselves, and they did not demand recognition, because that was not why they were there, and that was not what being Earthborn meant. Being Earthborn meant helping and healing and teaching and building. Being Earthborn meant believing in tomorrow, and for the first time in 200 years, the tomorrow they had been working for had finally arrived. But Emily Park knew that this was not the end of the story, and it was only the beginning, because there were still plagues to cure, and machines to fix, and wars to end, and hungry to feed, and children to teach, and the quiet ones would be there for all of it, not for glory and not for recognition, but because that was what it meant to be human. That was what it meant to be Earthborn. And as the stars burned cold and eternal in the endless void, Emily Park smiled, and she walked on into the future that her people had built, one small act of kindness at a time.